Well, welcome to Sophie & Co. I'm Sophie Shevardnadze. The EU is in a rush to sign the long-awaited association deal with Ukraine, while the new leaders in Kiev are turning to Washington for advice. Whose interests were at stake in Ukraine's revolution? Well, our guest today is former U.S. intelligence officer Scott Rickard.
A full-blown war on the streets of Ukraine's capital. The elected president forced into exile. All too familiar scenes of a bloody revolution cheered by Western politicians. But what's in it for them? Is the will of the people behind Maidan's victory in Kiev? Or rather strings attached to the revolutionary euphoria?
All right, Scott Rickard, former U.S. intelligence officer, is with us today. It's great to have you with us, Scott. Now, I know that you've said the United States government has been preparing the revolution in Ukraine for years. It's invested $5 billion so far in the uprising. Where are you getting this information? Do you have a proof that that's the case?
Well, it's public information. You have the folks at the National Endowment of Democracy who have been doing this since the unfortunate overthrow of your grandfather. You know, the Rose Revolution, there were at least 1,000 NGOs operating in Georgia at the time in the early 2000s that were, very responsible for the opposition movements that happened in Georgia. And this has been the color revolutions that started pretty much alongside of George Soros and all of the other folks that have been involved along the way. And it's something that's become sort of status quo with American manipulation of foreign governments. But it's not something that it comes as a surprise to me. Go ahead.
Right, but so you mentioned Georgia and the Orange Revolution in Kiev 10 years ago, approximately. And back then, seriously, there was a lot of talk about America and George Soros in particular funding them, and he didn't deny actually doing that. But what about now? Would you say exactly the same thing is taking place? Because many people would argue that it's not the case this time.
Oh, it's absolutely the same thing. U.S. aid is implicated. Pierre Omidyar is implicated. You've got the National Endowment for Democracy has over 50 NGOs operating there now. And, you also have the ties into Tymoshenko and, the notorious bosses of bosses, Semyon Mogilevich, who has been a sidekick for the American government, since the, preceding the wars against Russia in Afghanistan. Semyon Mogilevich was a huge supplier of weapons and a huge supporter of American aggression against Russia in Afghanistan in the 80s.
So you've mentioned Pierre Omidyar as the founder of eBay and also George Soros. So when we talk about the big capital and big capital players, we're talking about private business who are still spending their money on revolution, as you put it. What's in it for them?
Well, most of the money is coming from U.S. aid and NGOs. And the NGOs are actually funded by the government. The U.S. government actually funds the National Endowment for Democracy. And a lot of these folks are really closely tied to, Shachtman that worked for Nixon back in the late 60s, and who created this organization. And Cushman now, who heads the National Endowment for Democracy, is, yet another protege of that whole Shachtmanite issues. And you don't have to look very far into Ukraine. The most powerful, most well-known foreigner in the Ukraine today is Yakov Bleich. Rabbi Bleich is the number one guy that they go to get information in the State Department about what's going on with the government in the Ukraine. He's been there for 15 years, and even John Kerry on his last visit had a private meeting with the rabbi, and the rabbi's tied directly into these National Endowment for Democracy organizations.
But funding social groups or organizations, so the same thing as funding a revolution?
Well, of course, if they're tossing Molotov cocktails and not having a peaceful and what I would say a intellectual dialogue, using communications and paper and creating, what I would say, town halls and having discussions, that is funding a revolution if you're, inciting violence and basically the money's going to organizations that may incite violence against the standing government. that is inciting a revolution, and I think it's illegal by international crimes by far. It's one we've done it. The U.S. has done it in half a dozen nations in the last 10 years.
But here's the thing: the revolutions that you mentioned, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the revolution that took place or is taking place right now in Ukraine, many would tell you that those are also, besides everything else, a result of acute social protest. I mean, surely you can't deny genuine popular discontent. Even Russian president said the grievances of the people on Maidan are justified to an extent.
I absolutely agree. You know, the popular discontent is one thing, but throwing thousands of Molotov cocktails is a completely different thing. Put yourself in the United States. If we had a foreign government funding $5 billion to Canada or Mexico, and then, or maybe a former state that seceded, and then those people in those protests, were throwing Molotov cocktails at government facilities, I can guarantee you they would not show near as much constraint as the Ukrainian government and the Russian governments have shown.
So, Scott, the violence that broke out in Kiev, you're saying that was also planned, or did things just simply get out of control?
Well, saying things are planned or gotten out of control, it's a fine line. There are individuals who are very well trained. These NGOs operate on every level. They operate on the peaceful side, and they also operate on the violent side. I mean, it's pretty clear that the Americans have been wildly successful around militarizing jihad and violence and any kind of operations. Even Graham Fuller, who was very instrumental in overthrowing the governments in some of the former Soviet states prior to the 2000 time frame. At this, the demise of the former Soviet states, these guys were very calculated about working with violent organizations to create uprisings. And, Israel was meddling also in Georgia. And, the U.S. almost went to war because of, senators like John McCain. And these are situations that continue. And, nobody's really held accountable because the kind of rhetoric that's played out in the news is pretty much propaganda. And that's putting it lightly. But
what Kiev has on its hands right now is a burgeoning black market of firearms in Kiev. Do you see that becoming a serious problem?
Well, of course. I mean, any time that you have an unpoliced society and you begin the chaos, it's much easier because patrols are less likely. It's much easier for people to smuggle things in and out of places. I mean, just look at the last 3 years in Syria, how successful the foreign intelligence operatives and the mercenaries that have been operating there have basically destroyed Syria by the hands of foreigners. And this is what will be in store for Ukraine if the Russians don't protect the sovereignty of that nation from the foreign interventionists.
But if you look at things generally, do you think all these other protests going on right now in the world, because there are many of them, there's a civil unrest in Turkey, there is a whole lot going on in Thailand, in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Is there a force behind them? Is it the same force, or are they different players involved?
Well, obviously the times that we're going through now and the kinds of austerity that the European Union's gone through, specifically Greece, which is, they've had probably the worst of the worst. And then you have the, what's happening in the Ukraine with austerity measures. People start suffering from an economic explosion that really is in the opposite direction. We're looking at, times like leading up to World War I and World War II, there was a lot of economic, basically despair. And these are the kinds of things we're seeing today because the immensely inflated economic environment that's been created by the World Bank and the IMF and all the regular suspects that have, created a false market and a false narrative around, the domestic products in one country versus the domestic products in the other. And that's why you've got countries like Ukraine where the income in Ukraine is just the disparity comparatively to the United States is almost 10 to 1. So that's the kind of thing that people are dealing with in developed nations. And I think that's the kind of thing that they're uprising against their governments, because some of the governments are corrupt and, the people are noticing it. Now, is it induced? Obviously, it is induced when it's in the best interest of the United States. And it's very clear that the United States has spent billions of dollars on this over the past, I'd say at least 2 to 3 decades.
All right, Scott, we're going to take a short break now. Now, when we're back, we'll talk more about Ukraine's NATO and EU prospects with Scott Rickard, former U.S. intelligence officer. Stay with us, folks. With Scott Rickard, ex-U.S. intelligence officer. It's good to have you back with us on the show. Now, apart from establishing a NATO presence in Ukraine, do you see any other reasons for the U.S. involvement in the country?
Well, it's also economic and it's militarily strategic. Can you imagine if the Americans took over the ports in Crimea? And also, can you imagine, the kinds of revenue that they would be able to generate from the gas and the pipelines, just as they've done through Dagestan, Georgia, as well as in Chechnya. These are business individuals who understand the economics of doing business, just like they did with the oligarchs under Gorbachev. Many people made money during the Glasnost period, and they stole a lot of the wealth from Russia during that period when Gorbachev and your grandfather were working closely with the West. So there was a time at which, obviously, some oligarchs came to power and some were more honest than others. And you have that same sort of effect that will happen in Ukraine, because Ukraine has, a lot of great resources. And as well, it has good, it is the transit lines for a lot of the fuel going to Europe. And that is the main income. That's helped Russia bounce back. 3 times Russia's had to bounce back recently from the kinds of impact that the West has ganged up on Russia. And that's, you look, it's 5 times if you include, World War I and II, and actually the Bolshevik movement as well. So the Russians have really, had to play comeback many times to when they've been ganged up by sort of the NATO alliance, because that alliance has been there for quite some time.
Well, with everything that's going on right now, Ukrainians are saying, the interim government say, can you blame us for wanting to be part of NATO? What about you? Do you understand why they want to be part of NATO?
Yeah, of course. I mean, you look at the way that Ukraine is broken up today. There's really only about 15 to 20% Russians in major Ukraine, and about probably 60%, maybe 70% in Crimea. And so it's predominantly Ukrainian. You have a lot of folks there who, were very anti-Russian because of the terrible things that Stalin did. And then obviously you have the folks that were taken out of the area during World War II because they sided with Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. So there's a lot of different factions, and on the west side, it's mostly agriculture, and on the east side, it's mostly industrial. So most of the actual financial gains will come from the east, and most of the agricultural gains will come from the west. And at the same time, it's a much predominantly a Ukrainian society, and there is a form of nationality that I can understand, why they might want to have a free. But I think what you run into is that they fall into the trap. The European Union can't handle another boat anchor. They don't need another failed economy. They're failing already. And it certainly is strategically, from a military perspective and from NATO's perspective, they've been peeling off former Soviet state after former Soviet state after they promised not to do so. So I think it's
what
not
can
in good
NATO
faith
give them
what
in that
West is doing.
sense? If European Union can't give them anything, as you're saying, what can NATO give them?
It's what NATO gives every country. They give them massive amounts of financing. They got a lot of financing infrastructure behind it, and they'll create a lot of jobs around just the administration of that kind of activity. I mean, look at the announcement in January making Lithuania one of the leadership roles in the strategic alliance in NATO. So they're moving closer and closer to the cusp of. And there's a lot of money that comes with that. There's a lot of maintenance of military infrastructure, air bases,
Wait, so you're saying NATO will give Ukraine
comes with
money?
a good price tag.
Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. NATO doesn't just expect you to invest all your money. NATO is very complimentary when it comes to helping their allied partners in their infrastructure needs, and that includes everything from roads. It includes everything from fuel lines. It is a strategic military initiative.
So if what you're saying is the case, then it would really be 100% positive development for Ukraine to be part of NATO. I'm not saying for Russia. I'm saying for Ukraine.
Well, I wouldn't say that either. I mean, so let's say that NATO does want to come in and be they're also going to have to pay debts to their debt masters. So they'll bring the banking system with them. And, it's very evident that, very few of the new as well as the existing European Union economies, because NATO won't come in, as a state run only. The European Union will have to come alongside it. And so you will have some financial gain, but it won't be the kind of financial gain that will, satisfy all your Ukrainians. It will satisfy a portion of the Ukrainians that are siding with the NATO alliance.
The new interim Prime Minister, Yatsenyuk, has been saying Obama in the White House lately. Do you think he can count on unconditional help from the United States?
Sadly, I think the Americans are going to have to foot this bill. There is no way that the European Union is going to be able to come up with that kind of funding. The Russians had already offered $30 billion, and that was probably the best deal that they were going to get. And they're claiming they're backpedaling. Even John Holzman said in the last week's interview that you did, that they weren't playing honestly, or they weren't being serious enough. But the fact is that they just can't afford it in the European Union. So the Americans will end up footing the bill with an economy that's totally bust anyway. It's the only reason it's still alive is because they were granted global currency rights by the British Empire when after the Bretton Woods conference. But it's a total farce at this point because it's all basically paper money that doesn't really exist in this world. So it's just you're just adding another piece of debt to the American fallacy of an economy. And I'd be honest with you, I would think Ukraine should be able to see through this and work through this and actually use their industry and create their own economy and stay away from it. I think the Western economy is poison.
Well, you keep saying that the EU can't afford Ukraine, but the EU is now saying that they will sign an association agreement with Ukraine at the end of May. Is EU membership a prospect, do you think?
Oh, for sure. I mean, if they can do that, I mean, that's a coup de grace for them. I mean, they're obviously looking for that. It's the sort of the NATO expansion mode. I mean, it's the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance. Last time I looked, I didn't think that Ukraine was very close to the North Atlantic. So that's the problem that I have with this. You talk about hegemony, the growth and the imperialistic nature of the West. There's no need to keep adopting nations into this alliance. I don't think there's any threat from Russia, and there's certainly no threat from the Ukraine to the NATO alliance.
Mm-hmm. What about the sanctions that the United States and the European Union are promising? How serious can they be against Russia? Because, I mean, sanctions are nothing new to Russia, but they rarely represent any serious threat to its economy. What exactly is the United States trying to do with their sanctions?
Well, sadly, the Americans have been, sanctioning Iran and other countries illegally. I think it's an act of war. Obviously, it wouldn't cripple the Russian economy, but it would certainly inhibit their success. I mean, they would slow down the amount of success that they're having. the kinds of sanctions that they'll go after will probably be looking for alternative fuel supplies for Europe, and then going after any kind of freezing of international accounts. I mean, they've already stolen quite a bit of assets from the Russian investors and Russian bankers who were banking in Cyprus. I mean, that was a theft of assets in the Cyprus banking infrastructure by the European Union that many Russians who banked offshore in Cyprus took a big hit.
But exactly how far, though, can the United States go? How far can it afford to go in confrontation with Russia over Ukraine?
Well, it won't be as easy for them to do it to Russia as they did to Iran, and I don't think they'll be able to go anywhere near as far as the damage that they've done to Iran. But at the same time, there's also, they're looking at a scenario whereby that kind of pressure that they do put on Russia, it will cripple, some of the outlying industry that is associated with that, throughout Turkey and throughout Europe. So they'll be shooting themselves in the foot and also having to look to other markets. Now, that being said, the Americans are looking at developing other resources, but that will take time.
Mm-hmm. And what about Europe? We didn't follow up on that part of the question. Europe, it is under pressure from the United States, but it says it isn't ready for serious sanctions against Russia, despite all. Will it ever be, you think?
Well, I mean, Merkel's, kind of basically ruffling feathers, with her commentary. And obviously, Germany and Russia have very good ties on a lot of different products other than the petrochemical industry. But I would say that would a lot of the Germans would rise up against Merkel for that, because I think a lot of Germans see through the fallacy of the EU and of the NATO alliances. And they're not, they're probably one of the more wiser and obviously one of the most successful EU nation states, because the Germans are very industrious and extremely successful at their endeavors. So I don't think that it would last very long, certainly in Germany and other successful European Union states.
So, Germany is the strongest economy in Europe. It's probably only economy that's actually on the rise. Everything else is sort of hanging on Germany.
Well, England claims to be on the rise.
Well, it is kind of on the rise, but it's really just floating. But Europe is promising $35 billion to Ukraine. I mean, we can say Europe is broke. Germany is the only country that takes care of all the other European countries. How can they afford to give $35 billion to Ukraine, which isn't even a member of the Union?
Yeah, I really don't think they can. I can't wait to see Nigel Farage's commentary on this. He's one of my favorite guys who speaks at the European Union. I think he'll just tear them apart because, he knows the truth is that they don't have the money. And I guarantee the German people will not be happy about footing the bill for the Ukraine.
But if they don't have the money, then what's the point of promising it?
I think the Americans are basically going to float a blank check to, play their cards. And hopefully the Ukrainian people wise up and realize that they're basically taking funny money.
All right. It was really nice to talk to you. Scott Rickard, former U.S. intelligence officer. We're talking about what can happen to Ukraine in the future, whether it's going to be part of the Union or NATO. Thanks for interesting insight. That's it for this edition of Sophie & Co. I will see you next time.
Thank you, Sophie.